It is here. It is our last meeting of the year. So, wow. You're actually supposed to be sad and regretful a little bit, you know. And it's amazing. I mean, it really is. When you think about how the beginning of the year starts and how far away this seems, and here we are. It's a really intense time of the year. Obviously, this weekend is such a powerful and emotional time for us as a school. So I can't believe we're here, and I want to talk a little bit about how you're going to end and what you have ahead of you. And I was thinking, actually just a second ago, I was talking to some students about what you have coming up with exams, and I know it's stressful, and I know it's challenging, and I will tell you this, you will get through it, and you're going to learn a lot in doing that. And so I want to tell a story. I'll talk about a teacher, and hopefully make you think about why it's really important that you learn how to handle times like what you're about to face. The story is one I shared years ago. It's one of my favorite stories. It's true, and I think about it often, and it has to do with and it reminds me of the ways in which we can find within ourselves enormous reservoirs of strength, even when things are terribly stressful. And it's a true story, as they say, and it happened in March in 1835. And it happened in London, and it happened with a man named Thomas Carlyle, who was a British historian. And he was sitting in his London apartment, his London house, next to his wife, in front of the fire, and he was exhausted. He felt deeply satisfied. He was happy, and that's because he had just completed writing an incredibly important book, and it was entitled The History of the French Revolution. And he had worked with intense passion and almost oppressive stress for the year in trying to finish this work. And he had finally finished it. And you should think about how you feel. I mean, all of you have had some moment this year where you were working on a major project, an essay, a lab, maybe it was a history research paper, those hours in the library. I remember those nights that you guys have had where you're up late in the dorm room, you're underneath that cone of light, your roommate's asleep, and you're working later and later. Or maybe you've gone home where you're a day student and you have that pile of note cards and empty Coke cans and your computer, and you just work. And it's exhausting and stressful. Multiply that 1,000 times, and you know what Carlyle felt. And now imagine that a friend tells you that your computer's crashed and you lost everything. So here's what Carlyle recounted later. He heard a knock on the door, very unusual, obviously, late at night. And when he opened it, he saw his best friend, a man named John Stuart Mill, a historian and a writer, and he was standing in the doorway. There was a carriage out in the street, and his wife was sobbing in the cart. And Carlyle greeted Mill, who was unable to talk. Carlyle, in order to get some feedback on this book he had written, and of course there's no Xerox at the time, there's no hard drive, and the book was several hundred pages written, handwritten in pen. And he had given it to his friend Mill to say, could you give me some last feedback? I'd love to get your reactions to this, just the way you might. Late at night, perhaps you finished the paper and you said to your roommate or friend, hey, listen, would you mind going over it? Just check it for grammar, maybe. Just see if you have any reactions. And it would be like you going to bed that night, eager and waiting to print it out the next day and being shaken awake by your roommate saying, I got bad news. Carlyle greeted him, and Mill, hyperventilating, walked into the apartment, staggering, unable to speak. And he gathered himself, and then he explained terrible news. The maid had mistaken the manuscript, several inches of handwritten papers, for scrap, and she'd put it in the wood stove and burned it all except for 4 pages. 4 charred pages were all that was left of that year of work. And of course, he was beside himself in grief. He had failed his best friend, and he stayed up late at night, Carlyle with him. Carlyle tried to console him. He was inconsolable. He felt that he had ruined his life and that year of work had gone up literally in smoke. And the next day, they wrote each other these beautiful and uncommonly decent letters. Those letters survive. They speak to 2 men who loved each other, one who felt he had betrayed a friend in a way that he was unthinkable. And Carlyle knew that he could never write that book again. It was gone. And then what he did was he wrote something better. He found it in himself to get back to work. He retreated to Scotland, and he sent news to Mill. He said, send me any books you have. Send me books that have been written to date on the revolution. And a cartload arrived. And for a year, he wrote with a kind of, I think, unprecedented passion and intensity. And when he finished, it was a brilliant work. Historians in our department would say, that the writing of history changed with that work. It was an intensely felt, fiercely urgent work. You read pages of this and sense this book had to be written. It sprang from something deep and fiery in him. And the metaphor of fire is everywhere in this book. When he describes events in Paris, in France, the revolution, the violence that took place in that country, you often find images of smoke and fire. We know where those came from. Charles Dickens read the book and then wrote a friend of his later. You all know Dickens, obviously. And he said, I have read this book 500 times. Now, I don't know of a story of greater perseverance in the face of stress and setback. I've always loved it. It feels to me almost too much. I think it could be an amazing movie. I think about dramatizing that scene of those two men. Now, not long ago, someone asked me, well, listen, what will you do to reduce stress on Taft students? I mean, well, how are you going to reduce stress? And I gave an answer, but it was lame, and it was incomplete. And here's my answer to that. Taft is a stressful place that's intentional, it's healthy, it's educational, and if we were not, we would be failing you, and we wouldn't be preparing you for the world you're going to live. Again, I say, it is a stressful place, and that is intentional, and it's healthy, and it's educational. Students have been talking about stress at Taft since the school was founded. They always feel that their generation experiences stress in a way no one else ever has. And they also, after they graduate, invariably say, that's one of the most important lessons I learned at Taft, how to handle a place that is stressful. You should think back on Miss Tarrant's grade school meeting where she talked about her coach up at Hotchkiss. And you remember she talked about a particular practice that her coach, Miss Chandler, created. And that was clearly a very stressful practice. And Miss Tarrant has never forgotten that single practice. Her coach was not interested in creating some stress-free zone. You don't win games if you do that. You can think of other athletic parallels. It's hard for me to imagine Miss Sanborn saying to her team, you know what, that game coming up against GA is going to be really stressful. I think we ought to take them off the schedule. You can't imagine Mr. Palmer looking at the cross-country team saying, you know, there's some very steep hills here. Let's only run the flats. They'll be less stressful. Someone wanted that. I can't hear. Coaches and players know that handling stress is how you learn to be competitive, and it's a really important life skill. I was thinking of this with the actors in the spring play, The Skin of Our Teeth. Or you could think of this also with Les Mis. That play was an incredibly challenging one. I can only imagine how stressful it was to rehearse that and to put it on. They could have done The Breakfast Club. They could have done Grease. Those are great plays. They're fun. But they do not, believe me, have the stress that those student actors and the directors had. They wouldn't have learned some of those important lessons. Think of your teachers who set due dates for papers. That's a fact. We ask for things to come in at a certain time and date. Would you learn anything if your teacher said, look, it's up to you. You got an away game. I know you're tired. You got a lot of other work. Why don't you hand it in when you feel like it? That sounds nice, but that doesn't prepare you for the real world. Now, there's a balance, clearly. And we would never intentionally create the moments that Carlisle experienced. I thought it would be really cruel and unusual punishment to have IT Mr. Thompson, crash the hard drive or drop a worm into all of your computers. And we do say, look, if you've got 3 major assessments, by all means, get one postponed. And we say over and over again, you've heard Mr. Wilson say this, if you are feeling overwhelmed with stressors, that happens occasionally. That's why you got an advisor. That's why you can come to his office and say, I'm really struggling here. But a place where the daily schedule and the academic demands and the teacher expectations, they all combine in a way to create a place that's challenging and stressful, yeah, that's intentional and it's good, it's not going to change, and it's going to help you. The big reasons that we do this are that you learn to handle stress by experiencing it. You get better at it. You gain skills. You learn how to organize. You learn how to prioritize. You gain an edge as you enter the competitive world. Frankly, you just put it really simply, you grow up. If I sound impatient at times when I hear a student say, I'm so stressed, you can see why. Of course you are. I'm not mean, I'm not cold. I think I'm a pretty empathic guy. I care deeply about every one of you. But I know that stress in excess measure can be unhealthy and destructive. But I think that a reasonable level of stress, and what you will face next week is a reasonable level of stress, is something you absolutely can manage. You absolutely can survive and thrive in, and is good for you. I also think about talking incessantly about how stressed you are isn't really helpful. Sometimes I just want to say, stop talking. Get to work. Think of it this way. When I think of what great teaching at Taft looks like, I think of Mr. Cobb, who, as you know, will retire after 40-some years of teaching. And you've heard me say it, and you've heard others say it before. This is one of the single most extraordinary teachers who's ever been at Taft. And for all those years, Mr. Cobb has caused stress in his students. There are some in this room right now. A lot of stress. I've talked with alumni, many over the years, in particular this year when I would meet them at events. And they said, Mr. Mack, I was terrified of him. And I'd say, what do you mean by that? And invariably, I would hear stories of his high standards, his demand of accountability, and his sense that you had to perform. He was a source of stress. Loving, funny, expert, caring, dedicated, but a teacher who made you feel a certain measure of pressure. If you came to class unprepared, you knew you'd get embarrassed. In the old days, you might have a piece of chalk tossed at you, or he might just drill you with questions over and over that had you squirming and thinking, I will never come into class unprepared again. Stress, he could call your name when you were not looking, when he was not looking, when his back was turned and he somehow knew you were looking out the window waiting for the bell. He did a thing they're called cold calls. He'd look at Susie, but he'd call on Joe. Classes were terribly stressful. He would stare unblinking at the student who was unprepared and didn't know the answer, and there were two possible answers, and he'd say, there's a 50-50 chance, but there's a 95% chance you'll get it wrong. He didn't teach easy classes. There was going to be a quiz or a test pretty much every day. If you took a class from him, you learned how to prepare under pressure. And the article in the Alumni Bulletin had a section describing his teaching. Cobb is a classroom teacher, and it ended with a sentence. His classroom today is still visited by alumni who speak of a mix of emotions they felt walking into class that day, each day. They return, however, with a clear sensation of great fondness and pride in having survived that experience. Maybe you've heard the story. He claims it's apocryphal, but I like it. He had an announced test. There were 2 students in his class who missed it. They were day students who carpooled together, and they told him, Mr. Cobb, we had a flat tire. He was really sympathetic, but he smelled something fishy, and he suggested they come by the next day to take the test. They arrived. There were 2 pieces of paper on separate desks, face down. He looked at them, didn't take his eyes off them, told them to turn it over and begin the test. They did. There was one question. Which tire? It took you a while. Enormous stress for them. There has perhaps never been a teacher who was better in the classroom, who cared more for Taft students, whose dedication sprang from so much love. But we should be really clear. One of the many lessons you learned from Mr. Cobb, including the importance of living with integrity, of having a good sense of humor, of being kind to others, of persevering and not making excuses, of loving learning. Among all those great lessons, you also learned how to handle stress. There are hundreds of men and women who say that they're successful today because of what he demanded of them. So I know these next few days will be challenging. They're supposed to be. We work as teachers to challenge you and help you realize the strength that you have. I know that you'll be successful. I have full confidence in you. You have enormous capacity and you have strength in you, perhaps more than you've ever known, and our job as teachers to help pull that out of you. You're going to be a stronger person a week from now as a result. And you'll carry a bit of what Carlisle found in him in that fateful year, maybe. Maybe you'll carry the lesson that every Cobb student learned. And I know that you're going to carry the hopes of every teacher you've had who want just one thing from you. They want to help you grow. So it's with a sense of best luck in the final exams and the hope that you do well. And I wish you really the best. I will close by saying we will have a brief video. I think the upper mid-class committee has a video about the dance. Last thing I will say on the comment on stress, upper mids, do not come back to Taft in September without a draft of your college essay, okay? Please. And now that sounds like, summer has to be all work. I will close with one image of how summer is not always work, and it's an image of someone whose birthday it is. So Mr. Kevitt, could you just give a quick shot of someone whose birthday it is today? So happy birthday, Chris.